In 1955, weeks before Albert Einstein died, he gave an interview about what happens after you die. That interview was never officially published. No major newspaper ran it. No scientific journal referenced it. And for decades, almost nobody talked about it. But here's what's strange. Fragments of it kept surfacing, in private letters, in second-hand accounts, in the notes of journalists who were present. And when you piece those fragments together, a very clear picture emerges. Einstein believed something persists after death, not in a religious sense, not in a vague spiritual sense, but in a scientific sense, based on the same laws of physics he spent his entire life studying. The question is, what exactly did he say? And is there really any actual proof? Most people assume Einstein was an atheist. He wasn't. But he also wasn't religious in any traditional sense. He never prayed, he never attended church, and he openly rejected the idea of a personal God, a God that rewards, punishes, or intervenes in human affairs. But then he said something that confused almost everyone. I believe in Spinoza's God. Baruch Spinoza was a 17th century philosopher who argued that God and nature are the same thing, that the universe itself, its laws, its order, its mathematical precision, is what God actually is. Einstein didn't believe in heaven, but he deeply believed the universe was not random. He once wrote that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible, that it has rules, that those rules are consistent, that a human mind can actually discover them. To Einstein, that wasn't an accident. He called this feeling cosmic religious feeling, a sense of awe at the order underlying everything, not faith in a deity, but something closer to reverence for the structure of reality itself. And this matters because it's exactly this worldview that led him to his conclusions about death. Einstein didn't approach the afterlife as a believer looking for comfort. He approached it as a physicist looking at the evidence. That distinction is everything. Here's something most people never learned in school. Einstein didn't just develop theories, he changed what we think reality is made of. Before Einstein, physicists thought of matter and energy as two separate things. Matter was physical, you could touch it. Energy was something matter produced, heat, light, motion. But then Einstein published his special theory of relativity in 1905, and with it came the most famous equation in history. E equals mc squared. Matter and energy are the same thing. One can convert into the other. They are two forms of a single underlying reality. This wasn't just an interesting idea. It was experimentally confirmed, repeatedly, for over a century. But then Einstein pushed further. He spent the last 30 years of his life working on what he called the unified field theory, an attempt to show that everything in the universe, every force, every particle, every phenomenon, was connected through a single underlying field. He never finished it. But the direction of his thinking was clear. He believed the universe was not a collection of separate things, it was one interconnected system. And if that's true, if everything is connected, if matter and energy are interchangeable, if nothing is ever truly isolated, then the question of what happens to a human being after death becomes a very different question. Not a religious question, a physics question. What happens to the energy that made you you? This is where Einstein's reasoning gets specific, and it's the part that was most carefully left out of mainstream discussions. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change form. This is not a theory. It is one of the most tested, most confirmed principles in all of science. When a fire burns, the energy in the wood doesn't disappear. It transforms into heat, light, gas, ash. The total amount of energy in the system stays exactly the same. Einstein's argument, pieced together from the interview fragments in his private correspondence, applied this same principle to human consciousness. The human brain generates measurable electrical activity. That activity requires energy. That energy follows the same laws as every other form of energy in the universe. So when the brain stops functioning, what happens to that energy? It doesn't disappear. It can't disappear. The laws of physics don't allow it. But then here's where it gets more complicated. Einstein wasn't just talking about generic biological energy, the kind that dissipates as heat when a body dies. He was asking a more specific question. Is consciousness itself a form of energy? And if it is, does it transform rather than vanish? He didn't claim to have a definitive answer, but he believed the question deserved serious scientific investigation, and he believed that dismissing it without engaging with the physics was not science. It was just fear dressed up as skepticism. What Einstein said in public was carefully measured, but what he said in private letters tells a completely different story. In 1952, Einstein wrote a letter to the family of his lifelong friend Michel Besso, who had just died. The letter is now famous among Einstein scholars. He wrote that Besso had departed from this strange world a little ahead of him. But then he added something remarkable. He said that, for physicists, the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. He wasn't offering comfort, he was making a scientific statement. In Einstein's model of space-time, the four-dimensional structure he described in general relativity, all moments in time exist simultaneously. The past doesn't disappear. It is still there, encoded in the structure of space-time itself. That means every moment you have ever lived still exists, somewhere in the fabric of the universe. Einstein also told his close friend and philosopher Eric Gutkind that he found the idea of personal death unconvincing from a physics standpoint. Not comforting, unconvincing. There is a difference. He was not looking for reassurance. He was looking at the mathematics. And the mathematics of his own theories suggested that time, and therefore life, does not simply end. It becomes fixed, permanent, a coordinate in space-time that cannot be erased. He died on April 18, 1955. But according to his own physics, that moment still exists. And so does every moment before it. Einstein was the most famous scientist alive, but that didn't mean his colleagues agreed with him. When fragments of his afterlife views began circulating after his death, the reaction from mainstream science was swift and largely dismissive. The core argument against him was straightforward. Consciousness is a product of brain activity. When the brain dies, consciousness ends. There is no energy of consciousness. There's only electrochemical signaling in neurons, and when those neurons stop firing, there is nothing left to persist. It was a clean argument, logical on its surface. But then it had a significant problem. Nobody actually knows what consciousness is. Neuroscience can map brain activity. It can identify which regions activate during thought, memory, emotion, but it cannot explain why there is subjective experience at all. Why does information processing in neurons feel like something? Why is there an inside to human experience? This is called the hard problem of consciousness, and it remains completely unsolved. The scientific community dismissed Einstein's intuitions about the afterlife, but they did so while quietly failing to explain the thing they were defending. They couldn't explain consciousness, but they were certain it ended at death. That is not a scientific position. That is an assumption. Einstein understood that distinction better than almost anyone, and it is why he refused to close the question even when everyone around him wanted to. Here is what nobody expected. Decades after Einstein's death, modern physics began producing results that made his intuitions look less like speculation and more like foresight. Quantum mechanics introduced something called the observer effect. At the subatomic level, particles do not have fixed properties until they are observed. They exist in a state of probability, multiple states at once, and only resolve into a single definite state when a measurement is made. The act of observation affects the outcome. This is not philosophy. It has been confirmed in laboratories thousands of times, but then the implication is deeply strange. It suggests that consciousness, or at minimum the act of measurement, plays a role in how physical reality behaves. Physicist John Wheeler took this further. He argued that the universe is not just observed by conscious beings. It requires observers to exist in a meaningful sense. He called it the participatory universe. More recently, physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff proposed a theory called orchestrated objective reduction, the idea that consciousness arises from quantum processes inside neurons. If consciousness is a quantum phenomenon, not just a byproduct of chemistry, then the question of what happens to it after death re-enters the domain of physics. Not religion, not philosophy, physics. Einstein never lived to see these developments, but the direction of his thinking pointed here. A universe where consciousness is not a passenger, but something woven into the structure of reality itself. He didn't have all the answers, but he was asking the right questions. And in science, that is often where everything begins. If this made you think differently about physics, or about what we don't yet understand, subscribe. For more, there's a lot more to explore.